Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, co-host of the Enough to Keep Going Weekly Games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube, back with another episode of Talking About Games. Talking About Games is my mini cast, solo cast of usually it's a big news show with a big news rundown covering some technical, financial, and gaming community topics. But this morning, this is a rapid fire to kind of try and put some firefighting foam on a lot of the irresponsible reporting and discourse that I see going on about FSR4, PSSR, so PlayStation's proprietary upscaling technology, as well as the intermix of DLSS4. And a lot of this is oriented around a lot of people engaged in this constant back and forth between PlayStation and Xbox, which I've never really understood why that has to constantly be a daily thing for people to argue about. It's not like it changes significantly within each 24-hour increment, but for some reason, that's the thing. So it's spilling over into where I feel, and I'm worried that a lot of PC gamers who may be new in the environment, may be picking up on signals from popular influencers and maybe going off and doing some things instead of maybe paying attention to some of the other things that they should be listening to. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's talk about a little bit about why did PlayStation do PSSR in the first place? And to make this clear for people who've never been to the channel, I'm not a console gamer anymore. I play on PC only. I don't own a PlayStation 5 or an Xbox. So typically when I approach these things, I always approach them from an agnostic perspective before, because that's just kind of the way that I work in the technology industry as an engineer. But as a content creator, it's even more pertinent now because, like I said, I'm just not even in those environments. So at any rate, what were the business reasons behind why PlayStation did PSSR in the first place? In many ways, it's very much the same type of behavior that Apple has represented, in terms of where Apple has maneuvered over time to entirely control their stack, down to now they're making their own chips. So back in the day, Apple used power. Now I can't remember exactly what they are, but the IBM line of chips, and then eventually used Intel, and then eventually decided that they needed to control their own technology stack from top to bottom, and now do their own chips. This is very similar. PlayStation, in my opinion, wasn't entirely satisfied with AMD's FSR in the first place, so they wanted something more native to their own tech stack and more optimized for their specific hardware, which there's a lot of argument that often goes on about, is Xbox RDNA 2 or 3? Is PlayStation RDNA 2 or 3? The answer is they're neither. Neither of them are complete, perfect one-to-one implementations that are exact replicas of what AMD does within their RDNA architecture on the PC side. They are hybrids. They are half steps. There's always something that is not included in them from the full PC stack. At the end of the day, it doesn't entirely matter, because then software and APIs are used to better optimize themselves for those hardware platforms. So there's no point in making a one-to-one comparison, but for some reason people get wrapped around the axle about it. But at any rate, obviously PlayStation hardware moves as PlayStation needs it. AMD, while PlayStation is a big customer, also has other concerns and other focus and other customers that it needs to satisfy. And so you're simply in an environment as a business where you are not necessarily the number one priority on a daily basis. Lots of companies, as I alluded to earlier, such as Apple, always want to be the top priority. And the way to get to that is to just do it yourself. PlayStation also wanted that abstraction, that API, to be able to evolve in lockstep with its hardware as they evolve their hardware forward and grow as their hardware plans changed, right down to the minute of where they are changing things at the R&D level. So as they go from console to next-gen console, they wanted more control over the pace at which it happened. PSSR also allows them to own the patents and the IP around it and play that into their other value streams. And they talked about this last year in May of 2024 at their annual investor town halls that they held, which was basically a week-long investor conference for shareholders, where they talk about their overall strategy as a corporation, but then also do breakout sessions at the divisional level where they talk about the micro strategies that are applicable to each division. So like I said, PSSR allows them to own the patents and IP around it and play that into their other value streams, such as their standalone camera technology, Sony Alpha series of cameras, including their movie making glass that they also produce. Their cell phone cameras, which basically almost every cell phone manufacturer in the world utilizes, and has firmware implementations with the chips associated with those cameras. Their video editing software, which they do both commercial and consumer, and their movie studio technology. I think the other thing that they were trying to do is they were trying to kind of give AMD a kick in the butt, right? There were certain things that they were unhappy about, certain things that they were unhappy about in terms of pace, and they felt, look, we'll do it ourselves. We'll still collaborate and partner with NVIDIA. This is just the same way as Microsoft spooling up Intel to make their big data center AI GPU, but then not entirely kicking NVIDIA to the curb, right? You don't totally foist off partners that you are tightly integrated with, even though you may make incremental decisions to go in a different way with technology. So it looks like that provided the motivation to AMD, which is, I mean, in my opinion, why you got FSR4. FSR4 is not only a product. I mean, FSR came about because AMD had a sense of urgency about it. If you don't have that, and you don't have the collaboration with PlayStation, in my opinion, you don't get FSR4. So now let's talk about a little bit about some of the reviews and other technical details that are out there, but are not always being spoken to. One of the things that I want to go back to and start with is kind of where this whole discourse started going off the rails in the first place. And that was in the discussion of MSRP. So it's not necessarily pertinent to the FSR discussion, but you know, as this thing spooled up, there was a lot of rah-rahing, pom-pomming, and cheerleading about go run out and buy these cards. They're the bee's knees. They're the best thing since sliced bread. And it was all oriented. It was mainly oriented around this notion of this incredible MSRP that they were going to come out at $599, $550. But the problem is, as I told people, it was very unlikely that was going to be the commercial reality at retail that you were going to see. There were no reference boards that AMD is doing this time around. Normally, AMD produces their own boards and put those out. And those are things that typically come out at the actual MSRP that AMD puts out. But most of these are coming out. So all of these are coming out as AIBs, which means there are third-party vendors that are sourcing the chips from AMD and then integrating them in their own designs, which means they slap a larger cooler on them. They slap a larger cooling solution on them, maybe use their own thermal paste or special source thermal paste, or do other implementations. Some of the people have moved the power connectors around and put shielding around the power connectors, done implementations to minimize the impact of the 12-volt high power, I should say the 12-volt 2x6 connector that these things are using now. They do all sorts of different stuff. But when they do that, they charge for it, right? They don't eat the cost. There's a whole complex thing about rebates that were supposed to go around and things that were supposed to actually be available at retail that weren't actually, because AMD isn't rebating on every single model. It's complicated. But my point is that before these things dropped, I said you were highly unlikely to get these things at MSRP. The way that most people got them at MSRP is they got them from Micro Center, and that works great. And Gamers Nexus talks about it in this video here. That works great if you live within striking range of a Micro Center. But the vast majority of the world does not. And even for me, I live within driving range of a Micro Center, but it's in a high traffic, high population, densely populated area. It's a pain in the butt to get to. I never go to Micro Center. If it's not at Best Buy, which is a store that is closer to me, I'm just not being bothered with the whole thing of trying to get into a Micro Center to buy a thing. I would rather just order it online. And that type of scenario, I think, applies to a lot of people, in addition to just the people who just can't get to a Micro Center at all. So, yeah, stop Steve's video here. So, in addition to that, there's kind of the notion of the nascency of this technology, right? FSR4 has looked good in testing. It's looked good at CES demo. So if you watch the Digital Foundry video, you'll hear a lot about how it looked at the CES demo, and it's looked good in GPU reviews, right? Again, we're in the review window, and I think a lot of people who are new to PC gaming don't entirely understand how things are in the review window, and then how things are at the reality of once they're actually out at retail. Currently today, only 36 games have implemented FSR4. A bunch of those, right, some percentage, I think, I didn't count the numbers, so I'm just going to say 6 to 10, are from the PlayStation first-party studios. And so one thing you would consider, and a lot of the review testing that's out there targeted titles that are part of that demographic. And so it should be clear that obviously you can achieve good things when you're at a studio who's inside this proprietary veil and covered by all the NDAs between PlayStation and AMD, and you're getting help in the implementation and technical consulting. You have advanced access to the technology right before other developers got to it. And remember, a big thing that goes along with technology is documentation. So we just don't know right now, how good the documentation is, how far this is being pushed out to studios, and where this fits in kind of the studio mentality of when they're going to implement this. Everything reported on FSR4, I don't think is as rosy as people are putting it. And a lot of these things are coming from, again, people in the console space, people who are not technical experts, people who are not GPU experts. And so when they do that, in my opinion, they're misleading consumers, which has just been a typical trend, I think, within the console space. There's some more nuance, right, to what's going on here. Bring up one of the other reviews. So one of the big things that I recommend, like in the PC space especially, is don't just watch a lot of YouTube videos. Be well read, and so actually go out and read this stuff for yourself. Don't just go off of Twitter posts and things that you see on YouTube. One of the excerpts from Tom's Hardware's review that I want to read is and whether or not it's the RX 9070 I don't think is as important. It's this one note: FSR4 might make AMD more competitive, but DLSS is in far more games than FSR. That's today. So it ends up being pretty much a wash in our book, with real prices being the determining factor. And it's not so much that I want to call attention to that as a definitive about whether or not which card you should buy, but the point is that the evolution of what's going to happen with FSR4 with regards to DLSS is going to happen over time. It's not going to happen overnight. So just going back to some of the technical top issues, FSR4 mainly improves over DLSS4 in review testing by better image quality versus DLSS making for smoother gameplay by inserting, or DLSS4 making for smoother gameplay by inserting a greater number of frames. So with DLSS4, you have multi-frame generation. AMD doesn't have a direct answer to that. We'll talk a little bit later about what they do have to answer to it. But in general, like the basic over-under is FSR4 today, better image quality, DLSS4, multi-frame generation, more frames, so you get smoother gameplay. So here's my personal perspective. Whether or not something has better image quality is a really subjective review comment. Now, I will accept it just at face value, but the point is that in addition to that is the net impact of better image quality, to me as a gamer, really depends on what type of game it is. I don't particularly care about image quality when I'm playing Call of Duty or a first-person shooter, online, multiplayer, competitive, right? More frames may allow me to have a higher KD. In a racing game, which is another one of my favorite genres, image quality matters in things like replays and when console people are cutting game clips so that they compare Gran Turismo to Forza Horizon 5, which is a dumb conversation, I personally think, but they don't really mean a lot when you're actually in the car. So having played racing games on PC where, on certain rigs, I could get in excess of 120 frames per second, there's a night and day difference between when you have a high frame rate output versus a low frame rate output. And when you're in the car and you're in a corner at 70 something miles per hour on a Formula One track, or even on a rally track, you're not paying attention to image quality. More frames gives me better and more intuitive feedback in a turn, which means at the microsecond level, your cognitive processing, which if you've ever flown an aircraft or driven a race car, or just driven a any type of highly complex vehicle, there's this thing that we talk about of cognitive load processing, and we talk about it often in terms of an OODA loop, which is your ability to observe, process what it is you're observing, and then react to it. And so when the car is smoother in a turn and you're not dropping frames, right, as the car transitions to the turn, you're getting more rapid feedback in the turn. And so you can make a more improved and more informed micro adjustment to the car. And sometimes that's the difference between a couple of extra miles per hour in a corner, which can be huge in a race, or you just losing grip in the turn and getting the back end to slide out away from you due to oversteer. So to me, in those types of games and in certain types of genres, there are things that are more important than image quality. The other thing, going back to what I mentioned before, right, this topic of uptake, we don't really have any idea of how PC developers and the overall industry on how FSR4 is going to be picked up and what the focus is going to be. There are some things in its favor. FSR4 should be, I'm assuming, like the rest of FSR is open source. And so anybody can use it. It's why FSR works on an NVIDIA card. That's another thing that has been talked about, right? But theoretically, any NVIDIA card is eventually going to be able to do FSR4 just the same as an AMD card. I would assume that the AMD card will employ it more efficiently and effectively, but it's why when you have a GeForce card, you can still select FSR as your upscaling technology. But that also means that it's going to be available on Linux for people who are running Steam boxes, and we're getting more and more of those people in the Veil every day. But at the end of the day, AMD has 9% of the market. So to assume that the entire market, right, studio developers, publishers, are going to flip and roll and focus on FSR as their primary upscaling technology target and where they're going to put the larger preponderance of their engineering hours in game development is kind of silly. In addition to that, AMD, just from a personnel perspective, has fewer engineering resources. And so my expectation over time is that DLSS, in the speed leader fight, right, is always going to wind up evolving and moving forward faster, right, than FSR. AMD definitely has the ability to be smarter in some cases and more efficient and kind of sprint and drift and do some instances where it rapidly catches up. But at the end of the day, right, they're just skating uphill against this ginormous monster, right, that's behind DLSS. And so that kind of brings me to this topic of PSSR and the collaboration, right, with AMD and FSR. And this goes into the topic of where there's been a lot of rush to gush that PSSR is a failure. And again, that is also kind of silly. The best accelerant in AMD pushing FSR4 and beyond forward and keeping up with NVIDIA is its collaboration with PlayStation. As I mentioned, one of the critical challenges that it faces is it just doesn't have the same number of people, right, putting engineering labor effort against pushing FSR forward. By having access to PlayStation and the user base and doing this cross-pollination of the two technologies, FSR and PSSR, that gives AMD access to the telemetry coming back from an additional pool of today 70 million players, right, and more as we go forward. They get more direct interaction with the first-party studios who are implementing pieces of FSR and whatever the NDA is that they have with PlayStation that allows them to know about whatever PlayStation lets them know about with regards to PSSR. That'll allow them to incorporate those lessons learned into the technology stack, iteratively challenge, and maybe even keep pace not too distant from NVIDIA. By the same token, right, that OODA loop, right, then pushes NVIDIA. Because remember, we have had periods in history where we have had NVIDIA, Intel, other companies that have like a chokehold, right, with regards to market share, slow jog things and not roll out new capabilities because there is no market challenger. So AMD is collaborating with PlayStation is a force multiplier for AMD, which for consumers then also pushes NVIDIA, which at the end of the day means all of us overall get better capabilities faster to the actual gamer, which is all good for all of us. Another detail being missed from the conversation out there is that not all of the improvements that people are pointing to are a result solely of FSR4. And so I want to point to the PC World review. And for people who aren't familiar with PC World, well, it probably won't help when I tell you, but one of the industry greats who was great at benchmarking and just covering the technology space in PC gaming was Gordon Maung, who unfortunately passed away recently. Gordon was the hardware editor at I think it's under Future Games Network was the publisher, but he was mostly at Maximum PC. I think he also did some work with PC Gamer back in the late 90s, early 2000s. He had been doing this for 30, 40 plus years in his career. And the guys who were at PC World, which was the last place he was at, kind of had an opportunity to kind of tutor under him over the last decade or so. I think that he was there. So one of the comments, that they made in their review is FSR was frustrating to use and inconsistently applied. And that is a thing that not a lot of people are talking about. But the comment that I was making about the fact is that a lot of things that are coming out around this in this dialogue attribute everything to FSR4, and it's not entirely attributable to FSR4. In most of the dialogue, there's not careful, precise articulation around what things is RDNA4 responsible for, what things is FSR4 responsible for, and then there's this HyperRX, which is a completely different technology, part of the AMD technology stack, but not inherently part of FSR4. And so when you see a lot of the benchmarks and a lot of the improvements in terms of how much faster the card may or may not be over an NVIDIA card or just in general in a game, it's not entirely attributable to just FSR4. So kind of like I talked about a little bit, there are dependencies on hardware implementations in the AI compute units within the RDNA4 hardware architecture. So you're unlikely to wind up seeing those one for one on console, right, in the PS6 whenever it comes out. Maybe that'll be compensated for in software, right, with PSSR. But right now, today, you just don't know. So to assume that the FSR implementation on PC is going to be one-to-one, the exact implementation that you wind up seeing on the PlayStation 6 is just wild speculation. Like I said, some of it comes from another part of the technology stack, HyperRX. So some of the reported frame rate boosts are a combination of FSR4 with HyperRX and not just FSR4 by itself. This article here, this review points out, one of the other things that I've been trying to raise up, which is it leaves out, everybody having this discussion leaves out review comments about FSR4 being unreliably activated in games. And actually, I'm not going to turn on the audio, but you're going to see when Adam Patrick Murray is going through his review. There are instances, if you've never used Adrenaline, it is a very, I'll call it very detailed set of options in the UI. And it is a thing that you have to learn, right? It is a lot more complex than, sorry, I'm not sharing out the right video. So it is a lot more complex. I won't say more complicated, but I'll deliberately say complex than the NVIDIA control panel is. And it's just a thing that you just have to learn and become comfortable with. But the point is that you can put yourself in a situation where you're not getting the most out of the car because you're not selecting all the applicable options. Here, Adam Patrick Murray is going through the Adrenaline UI, and the thing that he's pointing out is that there are instances today, it may be fixed, where between the in-game settings and various settings across the horizontal ribbon bar, and you can see it up there, right? You have subsections in the Adrenaline UI that are gaming, performance. Then there's a completely discrete settings tab. And again, like I said, I'm not trying to make it sound like it's rocket science, but it is a thing that you have to learn. It is a thing that will trip you up if you're not familiar with it. But at the end of the day, the point is that what he's seen in here is instances where a user may believe that they've turned FSR4 on, but it's not actually on. And he refers to it as being unreliable, refers to it as, him thinking that he's turned it on, but then taking benchmarks out of the test suite at PC World and coming away with benchmark numbers that don't make sense if FSR had been on. There's also some implementations in FSR4 today that are at the driver level, so they're not available to developers, which means those things, as FSR4 rolls out across more studios, right, in implementation of more games, that they may be things that they're able to turn on, but they're not necessarily able to tune them and make sure that they can get all of the lift out of them with regards to in-game implementation. So that may be something that may change over time, but today there's some things that they're black boxed off from. There's imperfect integration between what's required in the Adrenaline console versus in-game settings and inaccurate feedback thereof that FSR4 is on. But then, like I said, then when you make the benchmark run, you don't actually get the indication that it was on. So kind of some big takeaways, right? FSR4 is a good thing that offers some alternative improvements over DLSS4. And some of those improvements will matter to some people and some people won't, right? It's kind of like the whole ray tracing versus rasterization, right, conversation. There are some people who want raster. There are some people who want ray tracing. For others, DLSS4 will offer better advantages. As it is today, neither one of those perspectives predict where these technologies are going to be a year from now. And so there is a final evaluation, in my opinion, that can be made. FSR better, DLSS4 bad. For PlayStation, PSSR will enable all the advantages that I talked about in the opening, right? Gives them control, lets them keep it lockstep with their hardware evolution. It's good for them as a business. And so that will be the thing that enables them to own their upscaling technology as part of the native PlayStation tech stack and do what they need to do for their business, especially when you look forward to the years of the PlayStation 5 Pro evolution and PlayStation 6. PlayStation gamers will have a better experience because of it. So for the people who are running around saying PSSR failed, it's kind of an idiotic comment. And my read when I see it from people is that these are people who have never spent any time and breathed a breath within the engineering space of R&D, RDT&E, early software implementation, early fielding, because there is such a concept where we will seed a new technology, right, to get telemetry back from people. And Microsoft, in fact, is one of the best people at this. Microsoft, and I'm talking about Microsoft, not Xbox. Microsoft often does things that frustrate me because they back things out of Windows that I use. But I'm familiar enough with Microsoft to know and understand that when they do that, it's because they're looking at the telemetry and they know that that's a thing that's not being used. They're one of the best in the business, and Windows is instrumented in a way that allows them to capture all that feedback much better, I think, than some other software applications and operating systems are. But living in that world, doing early fielding, prototyping, productization gives you, I think, a better grasp and a better perspective. And so if you have lived in that world, you would probably never come out of your mouth with something like PSSR failed. By the same token, there's a lot of overhype, I think, around FSR4 and where it is right now and what it really means for the industry, because everybody's trying to come down on these summary binary statements, right? This is always the thing that exists in the console space. There's always an effort to kind of spike the football and say that, you win, I win, you lose, whatever. But the key thing is that when people mention these things, they don't include all the caveats that go along with them. And so in my mind, that's really just irresponsible journalism and reporting. And it's really ignorant, in this case, of the entirety of the GPU experience and how this thing may play out over time. My big hope here is that nascent PC gamers who are looking for actual upgrade advice steer clear of kind of all the console warring nonsense, and the paper engineers who don't really know like a rendering pipeline from, a hole in the ground, and all of the misinformation that's going around along with it. Like I said, a lot of that reporting is irresponsible, and it's just going on in the space. And like I said, there's just a lot of spillover happening now from console wars, which have always been a bad thing, into the PC space. But there's also an effort to pick up on PC technobabble and bring it into the console space and use it as some proof point. At the end of the day, gamers are getting great capability. Gamers are getting great options. What PlayStation and AMD are doing together are things that are good for both of their businesses, given the challenges that both of them face, in the same way that Xbox changing its business model to focus more on software on all platforms is good for them. But at the end of the day, right, what AMD and PlayStation are doing doesn't mean being good for them, doesn't mean it's good for everyone else. Just the same way that I would say Xbox's strategy isn't good for the rest of the industry. And so these summary comments that like this thing is a definitive good and this thing is a definitive bad just really don't make a lot of sense. My big thing is here before I sign off is I'll go back to something I said earlier, be well read. Don't just watch YouTube videos. Don't just pay attention to tweets. I see a lot of dynamics out there of not actually reading articles, but like posting like the tweet. Just be well read. That's the most important thing that I can say today. All right, thanks a lot for your time and anybody who swung by and listened to this video. Until next time, take care of yourself, stay safe out there, play the games that you like. Come here to talk to me about the games that you love. Once again, my name has been Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, one of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going Weekly Games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel. Until next time, that's going to do it for me. Good night, good luck, and good gaming. I'm out of here.